Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be going over my end of year reading stats with you, as well as just, I guess, my end of year wrap up. So talking about the remainder of the things that I read in the month of December, as well as just a quick review of everything from this year. I guess I should mention I'm also going to include in this video my most surprising reads from this year. So let's go ahead and get going because it's a lot to cover. Okay, so I'm going to start by going over my December wrap up, basically. So if you saw my December TBR, you'll know what's on my wrap up based on that. I'm going to start by talking about the two library books that I got out. One was The Guest Cat. This is pretty short. I haven't read it yet, but I'm pretty sure I will get to it this week because I'm going to need some pretty short books to get me through the last couple of days of December. If I don't go with The Cat Guest, then I will probably go with And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. So you'll see this in my next currently reading, which of these I ended up reading. They're both library books, so they will not go towards my total books read for the Read What You Own Challenge, which I guess I should mention I am participating in the Read What You Own Challenge. So let me go ahead and put up there where I am at in number of pages still to be read. If you want to know what that is and what I'm doing with that and what this page number has to do with, if anything, you can watch that video. But to keep this as short as possible, I'm not going to go into it here. With my library books, they do not count towards that page count, so it won't matter whether I read these or not. All that will matter is whether or not the library gets them back sooner or later. Continuing on with books that I didn't get to, I also am not going to get a chance to read Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. I was actually really hoping to get to this book the week between Christmas and New Year, but I'm there already. I do not have time to fit this book in. And I also decided that this is book 2 in the series. And there's debate about whether or not you actually need to read both books in the series, but I decided I really did want to read book 1, which is Stalingrad. But I don't own it, so I can't even switch. So for now, this is just going to have to go back on my shelf. Next, I'd like to move into books that I either DNF'd or I'm unhauling. All of these books will go against my number count, whether I have read them or not, because all of these books are going to be unhauled. The first one I'm going to start by mentioning is one that I've already unhauled, and that would be Water for Elephants. So I think this may have been the first book that I read this month, and it was pretty good. I gave it, I think, like 3.5 stars or something like that. I was a bit disappointed in it because I was really thinking this was going to be a 5-star read for me. I had heard that it has a lot of elements in it that I like in books, and not really. It was just okay. I read it in one day on a plane ride back from a trip I was on, and it served that purpose. It kept me entertained, but it wasn't a book that I thought was great, and it certainly wasn't a book that I wanted to keep. So that one's gone. Other books that fall into this category, I guess I'll start with the ones that I just own that I'm unhauling, and I'll just briefly mention what they are and why they're unhauling them. So one would be The Thornbirds by Colleen McCullough. And I'm simply unhauling this because I happen to have 2 copies on my shelf, so I don't need both of them, so I will be getting rid of this book. I will also be getting rid of Daniel Deronda. If you have watched any of my previous books, videos, you know how I feel about George Eliot. He can go and join his buddies and somebody else can enjoy him. I also happen to be getting rid of this little book, which is on abstract painting. I do paint some of my free time. I've worked on a little projects from this book. It just wasn't the book that I thought it was going to be. I'm glad I bought it. I went through it quite thoroughly and enjoyed it for what it is, but now I'm at the point where I'm ready to move it on. I will most likely put that in a little free library since I think that's something very specific that someone who also enjoys abstract painting will really appreciate finding that book. The next 2 books I have read and or DNF'd and will be unhauled. One of those books, I guess I'll start with the one that I DNF'd. Unfortunately, that would be The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm not gonna lie, I made it about halfway through this book. I was about 400 pages in when I decided to DNF it. And the reason for me was largely just because I just felt awash in descriptions of trauma. And it was getting worse, not less. And okay, sorry about the lighting and angle and everything change, but I ran out of storage space on my phone. So I was telling you about the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. I was just saying that there's content in this book that is just a particular type of content that I don't enjoy. So I just finally decided to DNF it. I'm not going to come back to it, so I'm just going to unhaul it. I will say this. I really, really hope that Honorée Jeffers continues to write. I believe this was her debut novel, which I think is amazing. I will say that if certain content doesn't bother you, read this book. It was excellently written. So if you've been thinking about reading this, check the content warnings first, and then give it a go. I think you'll find it's a much easier read than you think. All that to say that this is coming off my shelf and it's coming off my page count. All right. The next book I read and did not like. And we'll get to that when I talk about my surprising reads for this year. And that would be John Grisham's Skipping Christmas. So I will be unhauling this book. I finished it and it's coming off my shelf. All right, we're going to talk about the other books that I finished this month. So I have three other books that I finished. One was A Door into Summer. I'm going to continue holding the books over here because even though they're in the shadow, they also won't glare. So you'll be able to see the colors slightly better. A Door in the Summer is a book that I was reading for my friend book club. My friend picked this book. It is excellent. And I had so much fun with this book. I also took it on a trip, read it on the way there and back while I was there. And I also found in a random place we went out to eat a quote on the wall by Robert Heinlein. And I'll post it here. It's a really weird angle because, like I said, we were eating in a diner at the time and there were people sitting right below the quote. And I really didn't want to go over and bother them and be like, can I take a picture of this thing on the wall? But while I was reading this book, I saw this quote and I just thought that was the weirdest coincidence, which I feel like is also true of this book. And again, I'll get back to this book in a little bit, but I did finish it and I'm keeping it. I loved this book. I gave it, I don't think I gave it 5 stars, but it was a strong 4-star read for me. I really, really liked the book. And like I said, I'll get back to it in a little bit. Another book that I finished this month was The Tale of Genji, A Reader's Guide. I gave this book a 5-star because I really think that it is a great guide if you're reading The Tale of Genji. The first part of the book, he goes into just great background information, that no spoilers. So you can totally read um, the entire introduction to this and all the way up to where he starts summarizing the chapters and not worry that he's going to spoil a major plot point for you. He really does write this book assuming that this is the first time potentially that you've read The Tale of Genji. And while it can be read by academics, it's not a very heavy academic writing where you're going to feel bogged down by jargon or something like that. Additionally, for the first, I think it's 9 chapters of the book, which are included in most abridged and unabridged versions, he talks about translations. He talks about the 2 different translations he's basing this off of, though you can, in my experience, use any translation you want. And for the first 9 chapters, he actually not only gives a summary of what happened in the chapter, but he also gives a commentary to help you be able to start to notice the themes that he talks about in the books. And then for the remainder of an unabridged edition of the book, for every single chapter, he includes a summary. So if you're thinking of reading The Tale of Genji and you want somebody to come along and like double check your work and comprehension, I would highly recommend this book. And then finally, that means that I actually finished The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. It wasn't a 5-star. I would not recommend this book to everyone, though I think it's a really significant work of fiction, very important read, especially in Japanese fiction. And I do think if you're interested, you could read it. I think there's just some caveats. The main thing being translation, I do think is important, especially if it's your first read, because some translators do a better job of helping you figure out the characters than others, and that's probably the most complicated part of this book. But I also think it can kind of drag. I like a good, really, really long book, and I don't think the pacing in this to read it from front to back is great. That's probably the biggest issue that I had with this book, as well as the subject matter. I think after a while, it was just hard for me to continue reading about a very like patriarchal society that in terms of its relationships to women like respected women, but in terms of like romantic relationships, I really just struggled with their perspective on like what romance was. And if you don't buy into that what's happening in this book is romantic, yeah, that's all I'm going to say for now. Anyway, I do have a reading vlog coming out soon. In fact, I think it'll be out on Monday, where you can watch me finishing reading this book. And I go more into my overall thoughts about the book then. But I did say that I would talk about what my final rating for this book was.
and it's a 4-star. It's a 4-star read for me. But I'm really glad that I reread it. I will reread it again at some point in the future, probably in a different translation, because that's always fun. So those are all the books that I have finished reading in the month of December. I am still currently in the middle of 2 other books. One of those books is The Soul of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. I was really excited to be reading this in conjunction with The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm about almost halfway through this book, and I will finish this before December is over. I'll probably just start reading one essay a day to finish it out. And then the other book that I am in the middle of is An Irish Country Doctor by Patrick Taylor. So I am maybe a third of the way of the book, through the book right now, and it's going really well. It's a really cute, just lighthearted, sort of cozy, new doctor trying to figure out how to operate as a country doctor, whether or not he wants to be a country doctor and what that means and looks like. And I'd say it's the perfect read for like post-Christmas unwinding, just finished the Tale of Genji, need a mental reading break. I am both reading it and listening to the audiobook when I have other things to do, and I'm sure I'll be done with this in a day or two. So I would suspect that before December is out, I will finish both these 2 books as well as one or if not both of those. So it doesn't matter much to me which, but that's what I am currently reading. That gets me to the point where I am ready to talk about my reading stats for 2023. I didn't mention earlier, but I will have this all time stamped below. So if you don't care to know about how my reading year went, you can skip ahead to the section where I'm going to talk about the books that surprised me the most this year, or you can just say goodbye now. I mean, whatever, skip around, enjoy the whole thing. I don't care what the YouTube analytics want you to do. You do you. So I keep track of my reading stats in 2 places, in Storygraph and then in a Google Sheets. I didn't start the Google Sheets until October, so all the stats that I'm sharing are off of Storygraph because it's slightly more likely to be up to date. They both say more or less so the same thing, though there's definitely a couple of books missing somewhere, and there's no way I'm taking the time to figure out where the books are missing. So I do know that my Storygraph is completely up to date and includes all the books that I read and DNF'd or whatever this year. According to Storygraph, I read 63 books this year, which sounds about right. And that's about how many I read every year. I read 30,907 pages this year. So I don't know if that's good or not, but that's what I did. And I was happy with it. I will put a little graph up here to kind of show you the breakdown of how I read those books over the course of the year. And you will see that I had some lower months and I had some higher months. And some of that just depended on what was going on with me, how I was feeling, how books were going, how long a book was, whether or not a book was secretly throwing me into a reading slump. So 50% of my reads can be described as reflective, emotional, or adventurous. And I would say that's pretty true. Now, this doesn't necessarily reflect whether or not I like those types of books, but that just happened to be the type of books that I read. 47% of the books that I read were slow paced. This stat actually kind of surprises me because when I look at what I prefer, I would like to think that I prefer medium or fast paced books, certainly medium paced books. But for some reason, I think topically, the topics and the themes that I like in books tend to occur more frequently in a slow paced book. I mean, I guess there's just not a lot of emotional, fast paced books. That just sounds like a wreck. So there you go. 48% of my books were 300 to 499 pages long. 90% of the books that I read this year are fiction. I will say this is probably one of the few stats that I'd like to change slightly going into next year. My top 4 genres are no surprise to me. They were classics, literary fiction, historical fiction, and romance. This is something that I actually figured out at the end of 2002. I have found that over the course of the year, the books that I liked the least and was most likely to unhaul, in my opinion, were actually literary fiction. So I do think going into 2024 that is something that I'm going to change. My top authors this year were Thomas Hardy, Rachel Ahrens, Wilkie Collins, and Leo Tolstoy. I will add the caveat that I know the reason that Rachel Ahrens showed up is because I read The Legend of Ellie Munpress, and that's a 5-book series. So that I feel like kind of falsely put her up higher than she would have normally been. Whereas Thomas Hardy, I intentionally went through and read a whole bunch of his books, and because they're pretty short, I was able to do a whole bunch back to back to back. So I read 6 books of his this year. The average rating that I gave this year was a 3.71, which I'm pretty happy with. I guess that brings me on to the next section, which is talking about the books that I DNF'd this year. And these are stats that I really want to pay attention to going into 2024 because I was very surprised by what I learned here. First of all, I DNF'd 23 books this year, or about 2,000 pages worth of reading. And I stayed in these books on average 8 days before DNFing them and would be about 19% into the book. I really want to change this. Most of the books that I did this with were over 500 pages, which I can understand. It probably meant that I got a decent way into the book and still didn't like it and was like, why am I still reading it? And George Eliot was one of the highest DNF'd books that I had. So again, if you know, you know. I'm sorry. I don't hate her. I just don't like her. So if you do, this is nothing. This is not saying anything about you or her. It's just personal preference. However, looking at these stats did make me go, I wasted one large book or multiple medium sized books worth of reading on books that I didn't like. So, one of the things that I am going to try and do in 2024 is recognize sooner when I'm not enjoying a book. I think one of the things that I want to try and do next year is be intentional about checking in with myself about 10% of the way into a book, especially if it's a longer book. Maybe it won't change the number of books that I'm DNFing, but I'm hoping that it'll at least reduce the number of pages that I'm reading before I DNF. So that I will, instead of having 2,000 pages worth of books that I read and didn't finish, that maybe I'll only have 1,000 pages of books that I read and didn't finish. And so I'll have an extra 1,000 pages that I've read in books I enjoyed. Does that make any sense? I know what I mean. Hopefully you do too. My biggest takeaways, rather, are add a little more nonfiction, keep buying classics, and DNF a little sooner. Okay, so the last thing I want to end with are the 14 books that I read this year that surprised me the most. At least it was 14 when I put this list together. So you can count and let me know if somehow that number has grown. And I thought I would share this because these books range a gamut as to why they surprised me, and I think helped me also understand some things about myself that I might want to take into 2024. Okay, so I have arranged these books somewhat topically in terms of how or why they surprised me. So the first two books that I'm going to share are surprises and books that I would not recommend. First book that I have on this list would be John Grisham, Skipping Christmas. I already mentioned this book in this video as one that I finished in December and I am unhauling. And the reason is because this book surprised me by how racist the family is in it. Yeah, I wasn't expecting that in my Christmas story. Look up the 1-star reviews if you want to know more about that, but I don't like to say a lot about books that I don't like, other than that I wouldn't recommend it. The second book that I have that I'm ironically keeping but would not recommend, but surprised me, is a book called Dangerous Hood Dreams. This book surprised me because it's horribly edited, but somehow still got me really invested in the characters and the book, and I wanted to keep reading more, partially because he didn't really finish the story. I am keeping that book, though, surprisingly, because I don't know, there's just too many weird connections and I can't let it go. The next couple of books that I'm going to mention surprised me because I was not expecting to like them, and I liked them way more than I initially thought I would. One was The Door into Summer. This book surprised me by how funny, how charming, how just sort of cozy in a weird way, given the topic it was, how deep and intricate, and just like I don't know, zany is the word that I would say. I did not expect to like this book as much as I did, and I would highly recommend it, even if you're not that interested in sci fi. I would also include in this list The Unlikely Escape of Uriah Heep. I owned this book for a couple of years. This ended up being one of the books that I really, really liked. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Moby Dick. This is probably one of my biggest surprises of the year, other than my favorite book. And the reason this book surprised me so much was because it started out just seeming like a really ridiculously written novel to me, and by the end, I loved it. I don't know what could be more surprising than that. I had the biggest shift in opinion on the book, I think, of all the books that I have in this pile. The next two books that I have that surprised me this year were actually rereads for me. And both of these rereads surprised me because I remembered nothing about these books and loved them more than I liked them the first time. And that would be Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, as well as The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I think both of these books for me held up really well to rereads, even though this is sort of a detective novel, and I feel like it could be hard to enjoy a detective novel as much the second time around. But I have a horrible memory, and so apparently it wiped clean my first reading of both of these books, because I swear in both of them I was like, have I actually read these books before? Yes, I had, but it was all new to me, and I loved them. The next three books were surprises for me because all three of these books had moments where I was just completely shocked by what happened in them, did not see it coming, absolutely was blown away. And those books are Far from the Maddening Crowd, No Name by Wilkie Collins, and I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. So I'll talk about Far from the Maddening Crowd first, real quickly. And I will just say this was the first Thomas Hardy novel I had ever written. So I had no idea of his writing style or how he plots his books or that kind of thing. I did discover as I read 5 more of his books that he does tend to like to have one very shocking moment in his book, if not many. But I'll just say The Christmas Party. I literally had to stop reading the book and just sit with my mouth open for a little while. I jumped. I wasn't expecting it. The next one I'll talk about is I Captured the Castle. I did not see where the end of this book was going. So if you want to read like just a really cute, lighthearted book that has a really good movie adaptation, I would recommend I Capture the Castle. It's not very long. It's a nice, easy read. It's a really good story. It's an interesting first-person narrative slash semi-epistolary action going on. And yeah, didn't see the reveal. I didn't even know that there was a reveal or that there would be. Yeah. Anyway, read the book. Read the book. And then there's No Name by Wilkie Collins. So even though Wilkie Collins, in the introduction that he wrote for this book, mentions that there's really only one big surprise in the book and that the rest of it goes along in the direction that you think it will, and I agree with him on that. What he doesn't warn you is that that one mysterious thing that you're not expecting is absolutely going to floor you. I was so shook when I got to the mystery, which is in the very beginning of the book. I literally threw the book up in the air and dropped it. And it took me a few minutes to pick it up. My mind was blown. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to think. Apparently, I had totally gotten into the Victorian mindset because by modern day sensibilities, the shocking part of this book wouldn't like make people gasp nowadays. It's just the way he wrote it leading up to that moment. You did not, at least I did not, expect what was coming. I knew something was coming and something was amiss. I didn't know it was that, even though I had read a little bit of the back of the book. If you want the same experience, I highly recommend don't read the back of the book. Don't read a description on like Goodreads, Storygraph. Probably don't even read the introduction in your book because introductions to classics are notorious for spoiling things. Just go in as blind as possible and start reading this book. And I'm telling you, within the first like 50 to 100 pages, you will also have the shock of your life at what is going on with this family. And then my last surprising read of 2023 is honestly just I was surprised what my favorite book of the year was, and that's David Copperfield. I've already mentioned this before. I'm just going to keep talking about David Copperfield for a while because I just love this book. I was not expecting to love this book as much as I did. And the reason why is that I had actually started reading it towards the beginning of this year and DNF'd it after 25 pages. And it was a soft DNF. I knew it was a soft DNF. So the next time I picked it up, I started reading. I got to the same place I was the last time, and I already knew I was more invested in the book. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll be able to finish it. I'm enjoying it more this time. I love this book. I love everything about it. I love all the people in it. I think Uriah Heep is the biggest creep in the entire fictional world. That man made my skin crawl. And I just love all the characters in this book. The characterization is great. And it was a total surprise to me that I could go from a book that I wasn't sure that I was going to finish to finishing it and loving it and it being the best book I read all year. And probably, I'll be honest, my favorite book of all time. So that's it. Um, that covers everything that I read thus far in December, gives you an overview of what my year was like, and includes the most surprising things I read this year. Now I've just got to edit it all down so it's a length you'll actually want to watch. In the meantime, thank you for watching. And you know what? Thank you to everyone who has subscribed to my channel. My mind is blown. When I started this channel back in October, I was happy when I got like my first 4 subscribers, and I swear 2 of them were somehow my husband. And one of them was me. So, um, to be at over 200 subscribers at this point, and to see how many people are even watching seconds of my videos, especially given like the weird backgrounds and the lighting situation that I still don't understand, like I so appreciate it. And you're all so sweet. You guys leave the loveliest comments, and I'm just so glad that I joined this community. I'm so glad you've subscribed and joined me to watch me do weird things with this unicorn and pick my books and read and not read and unhaul and haul and just share our love of books. So, yeah, thanks. And have a good day. Bye. See you in 2024.